Joining us in the Russell Senate building in Washington, D.C. is Senator Chris Coons. Senator Coons is the senior senator from Delaware. Welcome to Jesuitical, Senator.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Zach. Great to be on with you.
It's great to be here. That is Delaware, the state, not Delaware, Ohio, which is where I'm from.
I just wanted to clear Delaware County from Pennsylvania.
Exactly. People get confused when I mention I'm from Delaware all the time, so I just want to clear that up for listeners. Want to cover a lot of ground today, but could you just start off by talking about the faith that you grew up with, maybe the faith that your parents passed on to you?
Sure, if I could. Both my parents were Protestant. They'd been raised Congregationalist and Presbyterian. And when we moved to Hockessin, a tiny town in Delaware, 1968-69, we settled at Red Clay Creek Presbyterian Church. We went to church every Sunday. My dad taught Sunday school. My mom volunteered with the women's group. And my older and younger brother and I, went through the usual youth group experience. We had a very vibrant congregation that had a youth pastor, so there was someone who was specifically focused on spiritual development, pastoral care, who was also younger, a little cooler.
Yeah, that helps.
And I had a great group of friends who I grew up with. I later, as a parent myself, realized that there were things my parents had done that they didn't ever say much about, like, this is how we show you our faith, but they just did it. My mom was part of a group that volunteered at Emmanuel Dining Room, which is it's a Capuchin homeless ministry in downtown Wilmington, just making meals and serving meals to homeless people in Wilmington. She volunteered with a group of other moms from our church in welcoming a Vietnamese refugee family. After the fall of Vietnam, this was a family that was picked up by the U.S. Navy off the South China Sea, where they were in a boat. And we got to know them well as I grew up. And it was making concrete that welcoming of the migrant that we read about in Scripture, but you don't see concretely enough, I think, at times. And my dad, who was a Republican suburban businessman, really surprised himself one Sunday by raising his hand and volunteering. There was a visiting pastor who, was going over the Scripture about, you visited me in prison. And he said, there's a Bible study group at the State Correction Center, and we're looking for volunteers. And my dad ended up developing a very close friendship with a man named Paul, who was in prison for murder, and ultimately bringing Paul home for furlough weekends, which at the time, you just, what your parents do, you just roll with it. Paul was a lovely guy. We enjoyed fishing. But later as a parent, I realized that was a very bold and risky thing for him to do. So my parents taught me our faith in service more than any particular class or course, but it wasn't until many years later that I realized how much of their own lives and heart they'd put into it. They were very unassuming people about their faith. They would be surprised to have me describe this as being so central.
Yeah, I have a very similar experience with my parents. Who actually, my mom is Catholic and my father is Presbyterian, so I have a kinship with your family. But it was very much a show don't tell. We don't really talk about our relationship with Jesus. But I was constantly being kicked out of my bedroom so that someone who was down on their luck could stay at our house. So this idea of hospitality and really learning it at home resonates. But you mentioned, realizing what you were learning during all of this. And a lot of people are raised Christian and then it becomes something they do on Sundays. But that doesn't seem to be the case with you. You went to do relief work in Kenya when you were younger. You ended up going to Yale Divinity School.
Yeah.
So what was kind of the movement within you that led you to really own your own faith and want it to inform your professional life?
So without talking at too great a length, as a junior in college, I went to Kenya, and it was a program run by St. Lawrence University. The man who ran it, Paul Robinson, who I'm still in touch with today, was the son of missionaries in Kenya, had grown up in Kenya. And the most powerful experience for me was the hospitality of the families I lived with. I lived with several different families in different parts of Kenya who, by our estimation, by an American estimation, were desperately poor. And by their estimation, were blessed and were rich, and really showed me in their prayer. We went to church together. I still remember being at a church service in Ngong, a suburb of Nairobi, and it went on for 4 hours with great enthusiasm and great jubilation and parading and marching through town and music. And at one point, this woman sitting next to me turns to me and goes, "Are you a missionary here?" And I said, honestly, the church I grew up in could use a missionary from here. My white suburban church never had that much joy. And I was really challenged by the amount of joy and earnestness and intensity, really leaning on the arms, really relying on their faith to get them through very hard things and hard days. And I think part of what my dad experienced in prison was that people in prison pray hard. And people who are relatively well off and feel like they're in control of their lives and they've got this all figured out don't pray with the same desperation or intensity. And so I'd have to say the time that I spent first in Kenya, then in South Africa, where I got to work with Archbishop Tutu and the Reverend Paul Verlaine and Bears Nodia, who were from 3 very different faith traditions, but remarkable leaders in a time of great conflict, set me to questioning and thinking about my priorities and my values. I went to law school because I got a lot of pressure from my family, but I was there 2 semesters, and a friend really pushed me to go audit a class by Sister Margaret Farley, who was an ethics professor. And I just thought she was spectacular. Her teaching and the depth of her commentary and her engagement. The first course I took was Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, and Calvin. And I swear Professor Farley could teach, auto repair, and it would be riveting. But she took these ancient texts or old texts and the strange language and the complex philosophical constructs. And
useful for legislative text now.
Exactly, right, which are much easier, much more accessible. But I didn't take any religion in college, but I was very fortunate to have a debate partner in Tom Massaro, now Father Tom Massaro, a Jesuit theologian at Fordham. He was my debate partner, and I was this kind of jerk frat boy, and he was this religion major, and we did this kind of Mutt and Jeff routine in debates. But it had a big impact on me. He brought what he was studying and what he was considering about life into it. We spent a week together for the World Debate Championships, and it was the week when he accepted his calling to the priesthood. And he's been a real example to me in life as someone who really lives and teaches the social gospel. And then I married my wife, the best person I've ever met.
Want to move a little bit to some of the writing you've done about the need for Democrats to talk more openly about their faith. 40%, according to a Pew study, of Democrats or people who lean Democratic are religiously unaffiliated. And I think most people, at least in the popular imagination, sort of see the Republican Party having sort of they're much more comfortable talking about their faith openly. Why do you think that is?
I don't have a great answer to that, but my assumption is that in some ways it began in the 1980s when the Moral Majority and Reverend Falwell and a number of other groups and organizations were much more sort of publicly aggressive about a connection between their understanding of the Christian faith and a specific political agenda. And at the same time, there's folks who were raised in a church context or in a faith who either were victims of abuse, to be blunt, or were cast out by their family for something about their identity or their sexuality, and left faith and then began to see it and speak about it as something that was corrupt and abusive and fallen and negative. And the tension between those two, having some, sort of pounding the Bible and saying, this is the way and the truth and the life, and others saying, I've had a really bad experience here, I think led to a social or a cultural development over time of particularly younger and more educated folks feeling like faith wasn't cool or acceptable.
Sure.
When I chose to go to Divinity School, I was struck at the reaction from many of my law school classmates. if I had revealed to them virtually anything else about my private life, they would have been like, that's great. But the idea that I was someone who prayed, I belonged to a prayer group, I prayed regularly, I read scripture, I was looking for opening up faith and wanted to really study. About a third of my friends reacted like I was crazy, like this was the weirdest thing they'd ever heard. And I'm still sort of puzzling over how basically good and decent people felt completely comfortable mocking or marginalizing or attacking my faith expression. And I wasn't proselytizing them or trying to make them feel or see anything a certain way. But in certain circles, it's not acceptable. Stephen Carter was a professor of mine in law school, and he's also written about this at some length, how being a Yale Law School professor and someone who's open about their faith caused many of his colleagues to really question his scholarship and question his seriousness as an intellectual. I do think that Pew study about people who are unaffiliated, I think there is a much higher percentage of people I serve with who are Democrats who are spiritual, who were raised in a specific faith tradition, but who do not publicly affiliate with it, but for whom the reason they went into elected service in the first place was the view of neighbor, of service, of the importance of humility, of the urgency of acting for others and with others. Many of them, and I'm not going to start naming specific colleagues, but when I told them that tomorrow, this Tuesday, there's a Pentecost witness, a moral witness against the consequences of the budget, the bill that the Republican majority is trying to move through. A number of them said, oh, that's really good. That's really interesting. I really support that. I was raised, fill in the blank. Several who've never spoken to me about that. I'm also a member of two different prayer groups here. One is explicitly bipartisan. The chaplain convenes and runs it, and it's about equal numbers, Democrat and Republican. And the other is just Democrats, and it's mostly focused on racial justice and inequality issues. But there's many more elected Democrats in the Senate who are regular participants in a prayer breakfast or a reflection group or a spirituality group than you might imagine, given the popular understanding of us.
Yeah, so I think part of this is perception, but you also said there are people who talk down about Christians. One thing that as Catholics we often say is that neither party, can hold the fullness of Catholic teaching.
Correct.
And to oversimplify things a bit, the Republican Party has been the one that embodies the church's teaching on life issues, and the Democratic Party on economic justice issues. And it seems like often one of those is seen as like optional in the national conversations, and that being economic justice, because there are different ways to pursue that, and then life issues are more cut and dry. I'm curious how you think about that divide.
So Pope Francis, when he came and addressed Congress, laid that out as clearly as one could have. I thought that was a remarkable address. It was powerful. And he was, in my understanding, it was the Pope, completely faithful to church doctrine in terms of having sections of his remarks that were about protecting life from conception to natural death, and a traditional church-based understanding of the family and the centrality of the family. And he spoke at some length about that. But he also talked about climate change, welcoming the migrant, the immigrant, economic injustice, wealth and poverty, the importance of organized labor, if I remember correctly. He really spoke across the entire arc of the church's teachings. And I often say that the Gospels are neither a Democrat nor a Republican document. There's no clear, thou shalt cut taxes, thou shalt give health care to all. It doesn't say anything like that.
Are there any parts of the Democratic Party platform that, you have to kind of chafe against? Or
Sure. I wish we were not so absolutist on a number of issues where I think we would better represent the fullness of the American people if we were more tolerant and more understanding. I do think that your rough allocation that Republicans want to talk about and focus on sexuality and reproduction, and Democrats want to focus on economic opportunity and inequality is broadly right. And I think by each party being more open to the concerns of the other, we might actually make more progress and both feel and seem less sharply divided. It may just be the state I'm from, but Delawareans say to me all the time, why can't you guys work together more? Why can't you listen to each other and respect each other more? I'm from a state that has sort of championed reasonable bipartisanship. That's partly because we live in the shadow of New Jersey, where the politics are just bare-knuckled all the time. But I was at an event earlier today that was held in the center of the Mennonite community in Greenwood, Delaware. And there were 2 Republican state legislators on stage with 3 Democrat federal elected officials. We're all friends. We got along fine. We complimented each other. We, said positive and encouraging things about each other. And it was a ribbon cutting for a building that's now going to be a shelter for teens aging out of foster care. How is that not something that everyone could support? There were some community concerns. It required some federal resources, private resources, charity from some successful individuals, from some bankers, and this amazing family that donated their farmhouse to be this new center. But I have those experiences in Delaware all the time where we don't just wail away at each other and accuse each other of all sorts of horrible characteristics. And I do think that our parties have gotten more and more sharply defined by a few issues. And the American people, in my experience, don't live their lives that way. They don't get up and have a list of 5 things and say, well, we're not going to let the so-and-sos, be a part of our family anymore. They're not invited to Thanksgiving because they don't agree with us on this. The modern division here in Washington does reflect a deep division in our country. And there are families that have stopped having Thanksgiving together. And there are congregations and parishes that are more divided because of politics here. But I think it's our challenge and our call to model more humility and more grace, not less.
I wonder if you think there are risks involved with political figures speaking openly about their faith. I'm thinking in a Catholic context where, as Ashley mentioned, neither party has, the fullness of Catholic social teaching on their side, so to speak, where you have a situation where President Biden comes into conflict with some U.S. bishops over his views on abortion, or you have Vice President Vance, who came into conflict with the Pope on his rhetoric and opinions on migrants and refugees. Is that just a Catholic thing because we have such a hierarchical, structured church where people can rebuke you publicly in a leadership position?
Look, there's many elements of the Christian faith community that also have
there are people that could
division
call you out,
rebuking, and people that call you out. But it seems to be particularly a matter of sort of who's truly faithful and who's not. The mechanism of denying someone communion is unknown to me in my faith tradition. And so the first time that I went to, it was at St. Patrick's, I went to a communion, I went to a mass with later then Senator President Biden, and there were people demonstrating, agitating for the bishop to deny him communion. I remember being really struck by that. At the painfulness. He was so pained by that. And Speaker Pelosi has also talked to that. I have close friends in former Senator Bob Casey and in current Senator Tim Kaine, who are very committed to their Catholicism and for whom their faith is a real anchor to their families and their lives and their service. And I know it pains them to have such public tension with certain bishops or doctrine. I'll also say this, if I can, for a moment about Joe Biden. One of the things that always drew me to him and inspired me about him was that having endured 2 of the harshest losses a parent could ever endure, having lost his wife and his young daughter, having lost his son at the beginning and near the end of his 50 years of public service, he leaned on his faith and he leaned on the Mass and the Eucharist in a way that I don't think people who don't know him would appreciate. And he is a very private, he would really rather never talk about his faith. So it's a very intense and personal thing for him. And it helps him every day. And to be around that challenged me too, to be humble and to be more faithful. I'll say this about the question of, is there anything I'm uncomfortable with? I came out of divinity school more confident that I am not certain, and more certain that I need to beg God's forgiveness for the ways in which I fall short of what he hopes we would do with the role and the power of elected office. In fact, my daily reflection scripture this morning was, those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. And it was a reminder, since I'm someone who puts my name on billboards as part of my career, to be humble and to not be so certain about our direction.
Well, it's a hard thing when you're campaigning. If someone asks you a question, you say, well, I'm not really sure about that. I'm not as certain as I thought I was,
There's also maybe a bit of a tension about, this call that you have to be more outspoken about how your faith is driving your politics, while not kind of putting religious certainty behind the policies that you're supporting. So how do you balance that?
It's hard because I've had very difficult conversations with people who are absolutely certain that they know that the gospel teaches and requires this. And if you are not on board with this, then you are clearly not a Christian, and you are just a fraud and an apostate, and you are misleading people. And I tend to try and listen more than I talk in those settings. And to say, well, I'll give you a passage from Galatians. Let's walk through it. Here are the things that are clearly called out. And do you gossip? Do you envy? And this particular sexual activity that you are fixated with is denounced. Absolutely. I won't disagree with it. But so are all these other things with equal fervor. And yet you spend no time concerned about that. What is it we're really concerned about here? What is it we're really trying to do? And my hope is that how I serve and what I advocate for and what I engage in will in the end show a commitment to a broad understanding of neighbor, a deep understanding of the importance of grace and forgiveness, and a passion for justice. And I will obviously fall short. I mean, that's part of the essence of being human, is that we will all fall short. But I will confess to being excited about Pope Leo XIV.
We were going to ask, first American Pope. And what do you think?
First, I shouldn't say this because it sounds trite, but the first Pope to have been to a Wawa.
It's incredible. Yeah.
And I have a son who went to Notre Dame, and I don't think Villanova will ever let the Notre Dame community live this down.
As they should.
But seriously, I think his choice of Leo and his reflection on the importance of economic justice and of sort of reviving a key piece of Catholic social teaching that was in many ways at the foundation of organized labor and the movement to address inequality, the stark inequality of the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when he wrote an encyclical about justice for labor. We're at a time where there's going to be huge dislocations, artificial intelligence, migration because of climate change, widening inequality, and to have the voice of the church and of the Pope speaking up about these changes, I find exciting and challenging.
We know you have to run for a vote soon, but we're hoping you can answer one final question that we ask all of our guests.
Sure.
And that is, if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, who would it be and why?
Well, I have said I've met a living saint on 2 occasions, and have the blessing of still being in regular communication with them. So I guess neither is Catholic, neither has passed. I must say Father Thomas Sorrow is someone who his writing, his teaching, his witness is really powerful. I lived with the Reverend Paul Verlaine, who was later Bishop of Johannesburg, who's Methodist, and the fierceness of his faith and of his willingness to risk death in fighting apartheid really challenged me. And I'll never forget a conversation we had one night at his house where he was driving relief supplies into Soweto, and he was set upon by a mob, and they smashed his car and dragged him out and were about to kill him with a necklace, with a tire filled with petrol. When one of them said, "Oh, that's that good priest. That's that good priest. Don't kill him." It was just seconds from death. And he came back to the house, and he was shaken, and he was, and I said, "Wow, what are you going to do tomorrow?" And he goes, "Go back in, keep doing the work." And I said, I can't imagine doing that. And he looked at me and he said, "Are you still afraid to die?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, then I urge you to re-examine the seriousness of your faith. That's one person. Bill Perkins founded Friendship House in Wilmington, Delaware. He ran it for 30 years. It's a homeless ministry. He's still at it, even though he's no longer executive director. When I see him at a homeless ministry that my home church runs, he knows the name and the story and the needs of every single homeless person who walks in the door. He wears these big blue overalls, and he's known to everybody in Wilmington, and he is the most humble, dedicated, unassuming person I've ever met. He's as close to Dorothy Day as I think I've met. He's radically humble and engaged in making sure that people on the very margins are seen and are loved and are cared for. So there's two names for you, and I suspect neither. And look, here's the blessing I can still enjoy talking with and being with both of them in this life.
That's the best. Senator Coons, thank you so much for your time with us today. We really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.